14. And we really need to start in verse 27, but I didn't cover verse 22 and following. So very quickly, verses 22 through 29 of Deuteronomy 14, you have tithing regulated. Tithing regulated. So I'm just going to pick up and read some. In Deuteronomy 14:22, thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed, and that the field bringeth forth year by year. And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there. The tithe of the corn, of the wine, of the oil, of the firstlings of the herds, of the flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou shalt not be able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then shalt thou turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shall go into the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. And thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for oxen, for sheep, or for wine, for strong drink, for whatsoever thy soul desireth. And thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice thou in thine household. And then we'll begin our section, verses 28 through 17, which I've entitled Sabbath Principle. Now, there's some things we discussed in verses 22 and following that will come up again, so I'll just discuss those probably. Actually, you know what, I'm going to hit some of them right now. Look, for instance, first of all, this idea of tithing. Leviticus 27, there's many places we could go to look at this, but look at Leviticus 27, the last few verses in Leviticus 27. That's the last chapter of the book of Leviticus. We'll start in verse 30, Leviticus 27:30. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. And if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithes, he shall add thereto the fifth part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passeth under the rod, notice, the tenth shall be holy unto the Lord. He shall not search whether it be good or bad, neither shall he change it. And he shall change, and if he change it at all, then both it and the change thereof shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. These are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses for the children of Israel in Mount Sinai. In fact, if you were to go back to Exodus chapter 12, you're going to see some of these same principles. We have a lot in this section dealing with giving, and so I might as well go ahead and talk about some of this right now. We're not under the old law. We understand they had a specific amount they were to give. There were other sacrifices, free will offerings, and many other things involved in this. But to make application to us, what's the point? See, that's pretty much it, right? God expects the first and the best. This is not the first time he's addressed this. Go back to Deuteronomy 12 and verse 6. Deuteronomy 12 and verse 6. And thither ye shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices and your tithes and heave offerings of your hand and your vows and your free will offerings and the firstlings of your herds and of your flocks. If you go to chapter 14, verse 23. Thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, as we just read, the firstlings of thy herds and thy flocks. I was also thinking about chapter 12, verse 17. Thou mayest not eat within the gates the tithe of the corn or the wine or the oil or the firstlings of the flocks. Okay, the point is, when you see throughout this idea of the firstlings, the tithes, I think Chris summed it up very well. Give God the best. That's what we're supposed to do. So think about this when it comes to New Testament times. Let's make some application. They were under the law of Moses. They were to give the best. They were to give the first. What about us? Does the Bible and the New Testament talk anything about giving? Where? Many places, right? Acts 20 verse 35 is a good example. It's more blessed to give than to receive. Okay? Look at Luke chapter 8. Yes, sir, Brother Tommy. Yeah, I definitely have written by that. That's exactly right. We'll hold that thought because I want to come back there. I think that's the key. If you fear God properly, you will give properly. So think about Luke chapter 8. We maybe miss verses like verse 3 sometimes. How did Jesus conduct a 3.5-year ministry? He was a man who would work. We know he was a carpenter. Mark chapter 6, his dad was a carpenter. He was a carpenter. He definitely worked and earned money at times. But there's other times he was doing the ministry. He could not do that. How did he live? How did he eat? Well, he didn't necessarily get rich because you know the foxes have holes, the birds there have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, he said on one occasion. But in Luke 8, verse 3, you get some insight. And Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others, which did what? Ministered unto him, that's Jesus, of their substance. So he was supported by people who had money, and particularly there it's referencing women who had in control this money, and I think you're going to see some of them, of course, would have husbands that had businesses, and they were also involved in the affairs of that. But you go back and you think about this idea of giving to the Lord. Look at 1 Corinthians 16, this great pattern given in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I've given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Now we know in other places he taught the same thing in every church. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God hath prospered him. There's the New Testament commandment, giving as we've been prospered. That there be no gatherings when I come, and when I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, then will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. It had a specific purpose of that giving. We can study Acts 11, given to the poor saints in Jerusalem, other passages, but the clear key is they were in the assembly on the first day of the week. In the Greek, it's been pointed out by many preachers over the years, upon the first day of every week, we're to give as we've prospered. We're giving based on the way God has prospered us. I think one of the best places is 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. Look, for instance, at, look at verse number 4. Really, let's start in verse 1. 2 Corinthians 8:1. Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. So he's trying to stir up the Corinthians to give. He's using an example of what others had done. How that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty. So he's saying they're brethren who don't have anything that are giving. Why aren't you giving? Surely you will. That's abounded under the riches of their liberality. For to their power I bear record, watch this, yea, and beyond their power. What does that mean? They were willing of themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us, don't miss this, the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. If you keep on going down, if you go all the way over to chapter 9, I'm going to come back and make a point here about something in a minute. He kind of exhorts them in the first part of chapter 9, verse 3. He says, yet have I sent the brethren, lest your boasting of you should be in vain. In other words, I bragged on how you're going to give, so don't let me down. And then he goes down, I think in verse 7 is really verse 6 and following, 2 Corinthians 9:6. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart. So 1 Corinthians 16, as you've prospered, here as you've purposed in your heart, we know based on that prosperity, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you always have all sufficiency in all things, and may abound to every good work. And he keeps on with that same teaching. But I think the key verse is verse 5, as he's talking about these from Macedonia. He says in verse 5 of chapter 8, and this they did not as we had hoped, but first gave what? Their own selves to the Lord. So I believe there's the key. If a person is truly committed to God, both in the Old Testament, the tithing system, they were to give their firstlings, and in the New Testament system, we are to give, as Chris said, the first and the best to God. We need to analyze our giving and think about that. And of course, this is a very giving congregation. I know that. I'm one of the elders. I know what you guys give. But we need to think about this, even down to the fact that a teenager may have a job and make $100 in a week. Shouldn't that teenager give some as they've prospered if they're a member of the church? Yeah, they should, okay? So there's the giving as we prosper. But go back to a minute when it says giving, what did he say in verse number 4 and 3, beyond their power? Brother Jaggy, I think, had a comment on that. Right. Was what we would call today a capital gains tax. Yeah. It was a theocracy, so you had some taxes involved. Yeah.
He gave extra. Well, you have the example of like the rich man and the widow who gave the 2 mites. Mm-hmm. He gave out of his riches. She gave out of her
poverty. Right.
And she did so out of joy. And so here, when we're giving, it's in a sense, it's easy to give when you have something to give, but we're still expected to give when we don't have anything to give. To the point that. And to do it with joy. And so those are, if you sit and you meditate on those concepts, those are very deep things there because it's also not to be out of obligation.
Right.
It's supposed to be done with joy.
Well, that's what he said, not grudgingly or of necessity in the New Testament.
If you're poor in whatever standard poverty is judged in the world we live in today, if you're poor, there should still be that joy and that thankfulness to God for what you do have. And that's where the desire to give comes from.
Right.
Not the absolute amount. That's why we're to give as we prosper out of our hearts, as we purpose in our hearts.
To that end, look at chapter 15, verse number 9, and he's specifically here dealing with the 7 years where they're to make a release, the sabbatical year, if you will, every 7 years they were to make a release. Deuteronomy, I'm back to Deuteronomy 15:9. Go ahead. And not to what he hath not. Sure. Right. It's not the amount, it's the heart, the attitude based on what one has or hasn't prospered. And so Deuteronomy 15:9, here when they were to make release of this land and these bond servants we're going to read about in a minute, here's the key, 15:9. Beware that there be not a thought in thy wicked heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release is at hand, and thine eye be evil against thy poor brother. By the way, thy eye be evil. In the New Testament, doesn't Jesus say something about if thine eye be evil? That gets into a context of covetousness, by the way, in the Sermon on the Mount. And thou givest him naught, and he cry unto the Lord against thee, and it be a sin unto thee. Thou shalt surely give him, and thine heart shall not be grieved, is what Brother Jaggy was saying, when thou givest unto him, because that for this thing the Lord thy God shall bless thee in thy works and in all that thou puttest thine hand unto. Okay, we're dealing with attitude here when it comes to giving. Now, I want to go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 8 in my mind, verse number 3, where he says they gave beyond their power. How does someone give beyond their ability or beyond their power? Give me some suggestions on that. Well, I think it gets into sacrificial giving. Maybe it's you're giving more than maybe, I shouldn't say that you should, but let's just use that for lack of a better term, that you should comfortably, right? So they're giving beyond the comfort level. What about this? If every person in here is willing to take out a $100,000, maybe some take a $200,000 loan personally, Dink, you want to go pay off the building in about 2 months? We could do it. Pretty easy. You get a bunch of people in here, 100,000. How about you? Two? I can do 250. I can do 300. Building's paid for like that. The point I'm trying to make is this. That's why I'm not worried about the property here. We've used wisdom. We have a lot of equity in the property. There's still a big note, but there's also a lot of equity. We use wisdom the way we've done it. But I'm not worried about the money because at the end of the day, if we're willing to do what they did in the first century, that won't be a problem. And the one thing I'm most proud of, we have not cut mission work. We have not cut benevolence to widows and orphans. In fact, we have increased our mission work. We're taking on another work. And you know how we've done that? Because of you guys. Because everybody's giving. So I'm not getting on this congregation because we don't give, but let me tell you, we need to be reminded why we do. And here's why we do. Brother Tom pointed it out earlier. Go back to Deuteronomy 14, verse number 23, the last phrase, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God. So much in the New Testament dealing with fear of God. We're to serve him with reverence and godly fear. Hebrews 12, 28 and 29. Morgan, would you read Acts 9:31? And then, well, that'll suffice. Acts 9:31. I got to keep going. I won't get through some of these texts.
Then had the churches rest throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria, and were edified, and walking in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Ghost were multiplied.
Okay, so in the fear of God. Also, and we may get there in just a moment. Well, I'll go ahead and read it right now. Someone, 1 Chronicles 29:14. Kyle, would you read 1 Chronicles 29:14? And Wes, if you would read Psalm 24:1. 1 Chronicles 29:14. Of thine we have given thee. Psalm 24:1. What do you really own? Now, we know we own things because the Bible uses that language. Marxism is false, okay? You shouldn't covet thy neighbor's house because it's his house. But in another sense, do you actually ever own anything? Let me tell you something. You get older, you pay off all your debt, you still can't live without money, because what do you have to pay? What do you always have to pay? Taxes. You're renting for the rest of your life, and then you're giving it to somebody else. Yes, sir. Correct. Absolutely. So we're going to talk about some of this more in just a moment as we get through this chapter. Yes, sir. Absolutely. On the other hand, if someone loses their job, they may not can give as much that you're right. But truly, it's usually the other way is the problem. Right. And another thing, too, you don't pay everybody else, yourself first and others, and then pay God what's left over. That's not what the Bible's teaching here. A very, very important lesson is, I think, and I know it's important because he says it over and over. For instance, look at verse 24 and 25. And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou not be able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose. Of course, he gives regulation regarding redemption of things that could be turned into money. But he goes on and says, here's the key, what I want you to see right now. Which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then shalt thou turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shalt go unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Now, this has to be a big deal, because if you go back to chapter 12, turn in Deuteronomy and look at chapter 12, verse number 5. But unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose out of all your tribes to put his name there, even unto his habitation, shall ye seek, and thither shall ye come. Chapter 12, verse 11. I'm not going to read the whole verse, but you get the point. A place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there, thither shall you bring all that I command you. Look at verse number 18. But thou must eat them before the Lord thy God in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Now, do I have to go to 16:2, 16:7, 16:15, 18:6, 26:2 and read it again and again and again and again? Or do you get the point? Why is he saying this? And the point is, just as in the Old Testament, there was a place that this was to take place, so there is in the New Testament today. When we come, as we're going to do here in about an hour, together, James chapter 2 talks about if one in poor raiment enter into your assembly. Okay, Acts 20 verse 7, upon the first day of the week when the disciples met together, to break bread. That's the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians 11 through 16, it's used over and over and over. Come together in one place, King James, in one place, in one place. We come together as an assembly. I wrote a paper on this, 3.5 years ago. I had to dust that paper off. I couldn't even find the thing. Somebody found it for me. I reread my own paper, and then I wrote an outline and put on top of it to preach a sermon in about next year that I've been assigned on virtual worship. And it brought me back to some of those memories that at the time that I read through. I have no idea how our brethren have missed this in some, especially the ongoing virtual worship idea. And I'm talking about first day of the week worship. Let me tell you something. You cannot get together and virtually worship in the assembling of the saints, because an assembly is required inherently in the New Testament. And it wasn't any different in the Old Testament. He says it over and over. There's a place that you're to come to do certain of these things. And so today, when we come together to remember the Lord and the Lord's Supper, and we commune one with another, we sing one with another, we give in the collection, which is to be done in the assembling of the saints on the first day of the week, 1 Corinthians 16. These things are not difficult. In fact, they're basics. But many people have missed this over the last number of years. No. Sure.
But he also says you have to give in this place.
Right.
You might, he's getting ahead of the people here. They're going to say, well, I've got all these sheep. How do I drive all these animals down to Jerusalem? I'll do it easy. I'll give it here. They're going to start changing things.
Right.
And so God is getting ahead of them with their excuses and saying, no, you're going to give your sheep wherever you are. You sell them there. You bring the money to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, you buy some sheep, and then those are the ones you come in and you offer, or you redeem it in other ways. And so God is saying, look, there's a method to do this that you don't have to, that you can't get out of.
Right. There's a pattern. If you read Deuteronomy, you see this, there is a pattern. In the New Testament, there is a pattern. Before we go to verse 27, I don't want to get caught up on this because we just had a sermon on it, but here he talks about all these things. He mentions wine and strong drink. You got to study, brethren, because what does he say in this very verse? And thou shalt what before the Lord? Eat. I believe he's dealing with the way some of this will be used in generically, or you're dealing with sweet fruits or things of that nature, but certainly he's not telling them to be involved in alcoholism as they come to worship God. So you got to study that more fully in the way that these things would be used in context. The Levite that is within the gates, verse 27, I want to hit on this. Thou shalt not forsake him. Let me read verse 27 and following of Deuteronomy 14. And the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him, for he hath no part nor inheritance with thee. At the end of 3 years, so we're getting to more some of these specifications of certain kinds of giving, thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shall lay it up within thy gates. You get into different types of giving, some that were for the priest, some that was communal giving to be used for the poor, and so forth and so on. But verse 29, and the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work which thy hand which thou doest. What is he getting at here when he talks about this idea of the Levite and the stranger and the fatherless and the widows? He's simply saying those that need to be taken care of because they rely upon others for their sustenance, they're to be taken care of properly. And what does he say in verse 27? Thou shalt not forsake him. Now we know in the New Testament, of course, all Christians are priests, but the Levites had certain duties. I would in a very way of application, think about again preachers today. Or widows, or orphans. Widows and orphans, they're destitute. But a preacher, if he's full-time preaching, what does the Bible say in Galatians 8 and 1 Corinthians 9? If a man preach the gospel, he should live in the gospel, okay? Now, there's occasions where a preacher can support himself. We see that too. But if elders have chosen to use a preacher, there's everything right with being able to pay that preacher, or even a paid elder. 1 Timothy 5 talks about that, an elder that labors in the words worthy of double honor, literally a double stipend, extra pay, if you will, because of all that he's involved in. So when I think about this thing, I think about all these scriptures that deal with giving. Somebody read Galatians 6:6. Brother Mowdy, would you read that? And then Dink, would you read 1 Corinthians 9:14? Wade, would you read 2 Peter 2:15? Okay, Galatians 6:6. Let him that is taught in the word, think about a congregation, let them do what? Communicate, that's giving, unto who? Unto him that teacheth in all good things. So we're talking about paying a preacher, paying those who are involved in ministry. Okay, 1 Corinthians 9:14. Okay, as opposed to 2 Peter 2:15. Love the wages of unrighteousness. So if you're paying a preacher who's a false teacher money, you're wasting every penny you give that man. On the other hand, if you're paying a godly man, you can't pay them too much because they're godly. They'll just give as they've prospered. And I've seen abuses, either through stories I've heard or some I've seen personally, where you would have men of God who've committed themselves to preach and to teach, and congregations neglect them. They don't give them raises. They don't take care of their family. They literally treat them like dirt. That is a very, very wrong principle according to Scripture. That's wrong. On the other hand, I've seen lazy preachers and bums who shouldn't be working and preaching. They should be doing something else because they're not working hard to do the Lord's work. I've seen that extreme as well. I've seen some preachers who both preach, teach, and get income, but they also work secular. It's a combination. Circumstances would dictate all of these things. But you see these principles here about taking care of the Levites, as well as clearly the fatherless, the strangers, the widows. And it says why, verse 29, the end of the verse, that the Lord may bless you. Chapter 15, verse 1 and following. I'm not going to read all this, but I'm going to break down this chapter. If you're taking notes, in chapter 15, verses 1 through 6 deal with creditors and debt. Verses 1 through 6. Verses 7 through 11 deal with the poor. 7 through 11 deal with the poor. 12 through 18 deals with slaves, particularly indentured servants, those who would be brought into debt and slavery because of certain things. Chapter 15, verse 12 through 18. And then verses 19 through 23, the end of this chapter, is dealing with firstborn animals, and again, giving God our best. First of all, let's draw a few lessons from the first 6 verses regarding this idea of creditors. He talks about this, these 7 years, this release, this remission of debt that was to take place on the 7th year. Verse 1, at the end of every 7 years thou shalt make a release. And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again. That's interesting. But that which is thine with thy brother thine hand shall release, save when there shall be no poor among you, for the Lord shall greatly bless thee in the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it. Only if thou carefully hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all these commandments which I command thee this day, for the Lord thy God blesseth thee as he promised thee, and thou shalt lend unto many nations, but thou shalt not borrow. And thou shalt reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over thee. Okay, someone go to Proverbs. Jackson, would you go to Proverbs and read 21:20? Brother Logan, would you read Psalm 112, verse 1 and verse 5? And Brother Greg, would you read Proverbs 22:7? Proverbs 21:20, Jackson. Okay, so a wise man's going to save some money, have some things. That's not a bad thing at all. Okay, Psalm 112, verse 1 and 5. Showeth favor and lendeth, but shows discretion, because Proverbs often talks about don't be a cosigner. That's a very unwise thing. Okay, look at Proverbs 22:7. Okay, if you owe money, just get the scriptures make it real clear. Then who's in charge of that relationship? The one owing the money, or the one that holds the debt? The one that owns the debt, right, as opposed to those who owe the debt. Now, that doesn't mean it's a sin to have a debt, because you're seeing right here, these were God's people, and some of them would get in debt. Some of them may have got in debt because of a sickness or other issues that they did. A lot of this, by the way, these resets, especially the year of Jubilee, Leviticus 25, what was the bigger overarching picture? We can't lose the land because there has to be a clear-cut tribe of Judah to bring Jesus into the world. Don't miss that as you read all these laws. But there are many principles here about debt and owing money and not owing money. Some people talk about bad debt versus good debt. Some people say there's no such thing as bad debt. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. The Bible says in the New Testament, owe no man anything. That doesn't mean you can't have debt. It means pay your debts. You may owe money on a house. I don't think that's a bad debt in our economy and where we live in our country. But on the other hand, if you're running up money on a credit card because you can't control yourself with fun, that is extremely dumb. Okay? And so you need to keep all these things in mind. These principles of money, that's what we're dealing with. Yes, sir. Somebody have a hand up, I thought? Okay, I'm seeing things. Okay, never mind. I was going to make a comment about football. I'm not going to do it. Okay, so look at verses. There's so much we could talk about debt, things like that. The Bible has a lot to say about that. Verse number 7 through 11, the poor. If there be among you a poor man, Jesus said in John 12:8, by the way, the poor, you're going to always have the poor with you. Of one of thy brethren, James 2:5 says those who are poor among the church were rich in faith, oftentimes. Within any of thy gates in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thy heart, nor shut thine hand from thy poor brother. I think about James 2:14 and following. He has a need. You see he's hungry. You see he doesn't have clothing. You say, be ye warmed and filled. The Bible says that's not faith. Also, 1 John 3:17 and following says, really verse 18, let us love not in word, but in deed and in truth. Talking about active giving and taking care of our brethren. Verse 8, but thou shalt open thine hand wide unto him, and shall surely lend him sufficient for his need, in that which he wanteth. Again, you go to the Sermon on the Mount, and ask for your coat, give him your cloak also. Many other principles here. Beware that there be not a thought in thy wicked heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of release is at hand, and thine eye be evil against the poor brother, and thou givest him naught, and he cry unto the Lord against thee, and it be a sin unto thee. Thou shalt surely give him, and thine heart shall not be grieved when thou givest unto him, because that for this thing the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all the works, and in all that thou puttest thine hand unto. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command thee, saying, thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to the poor and to the needy in thy land. Now let's talk about this for just a moment. Clearly, he's not saying that you can't, that you should just give everything you have to the poor, because otherwise, how would they have these needs for the seventh year of release if there wasn't some debt, and those that didn't, that held the debt, and those that owed the money, and that kind of thing? The principles of Scripture, oftentimes there's a fine line. I'll give you an example. The Bible says in 2 Thessalonians, 2 brethren, chapter 3, verse 10, if a man won't work, help me, neither should he eat. It can be a sin to give money to a bum, because you're literally violating that commandment. On the other hand, if there is a true need, James 1:27 says, pure religion, undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit, that means go to the need of, the widow and orphan, that's considered pure religion. So does not one's circumstances, and I'm going to use the word common sense, that means proper biblical reasoning, come into play in all of this? You have a person that has a need, Galatians 6:10, as you have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, watch it, especially unto those that are of the household of faith. And so I think a holistic approach to these principles in the Old Testament, as well as in our New Testament teachings, would teach us how to deal with certain things. Yes, yes.
So the poor man just doesn't get out of things because he's poor, but the rich man still has obligations. So in this section here, it looks like the needy man still has need. He's coming to the rich man for some kind of loan.
Right.
And the rich man says, no, it's too close to the year of release. I'm not going to loan it to you. You can't pay it back in that time. And then I have to wipe the debt away. So I'm not going to give it to you at all.
And the Bible will also address that, because what he'll say is pay what it's worth, don't overpay. Because if that's the case, and you know it's going to be released in a year, you're not going to pay what you would in the first year, because later he's going to talk about that God's blessing you, double blessing you. You have a servant here who you release that's a slave, a servant, and they've been like a double hired servant to you because they've worked so hard and they've done such a diligent job. Why not bless them even more? There are so many wonderful principles of how to treat people in these scriptures, really. Okay, we'll maybe hit some more of that in a moment. But go to verse number. Oh, I got so many verses I'm skipping here. We just can't get them all. Go to verse 12. And if thy brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee. Now, don't be thinking 1800s slavery in the United States necessarily. Think about indentured servants. Someone, man, I need a job. I need to be obligated to you, if you will, to the point of being a servant to get out of this debt or whatever. And then it says, and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year thou shalt let him go free from thee. You can go read about this in Exodus 21, Leviticus 25, and other places dealing with aspects of this. There's different situations here. The sabbatical year, 7th release versus Jubilee, which is every 50 years and so forth. And when thou sendest him out free from thee, notice verse 13, thou shalt not let him go away empty. Can we say it this way? Give him a bonus. Proverbs 3, 27 and 28. Brother Cheek, would you read that? Proverbs 3, 27 and 28. Proverbs 3, 27 and 28. Yes, sir. And then we're going to go right back to verse 14 of chapter 15. Yeah, 27 or 28. Okay. Have you ever given something to someone and then went and told them, hey, don't worry about it, I didn't want the money back? It's very rewarding. You should try that. Maybe $5, maybe $20. On the other hand, this may be a person who needs some responsibility, and you say, look, I love you, but you need to pay me my $20 back. I mean, it depends on the circumstances, I think, with these things, as you'll see in the Scriptures. So don't go crazy one way or the other here. You'll miss the point of these principles. Proverbs 3, 27 and 28. Okay, and then he says in verse 13, don't let him go away empty. Verse 14, thou shalt furnish him liberally out of thy flock and out of thy floor and out of thy winepress. That way, by the way, winepress, it shows you all alcohol is not, or it's not alcoholic, because wine here is clearly grape juice squisher. That's an East Texan terminology. Of that wherewith the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, thou shalt give unto him. There it is. How much you've been blessed, be willing to give. Luke 6, by the way, you should read verse 27 and following, particularly I think it's verse 38, talks about if you give, you can't outgive God. He'll give it back to you shaken, pressed, with measure and without measure and so forth. Verse 15, and thou shalt, and here it is. Isn't this a key word in Deuteronomy? And thou shalt remember. There it is. I'm in Deuteronomy 15:15. Thou shalt remember that thou was a bondman in the land of Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee. Therefore I command thee this thing today. And it shall be, if he say unto thee, I will not go away from thee, because he loveth thee and thine house, because he is well with thee, then thou shalt take an awl and thrust it through his ear into the door. There's a song sometimes we sing like that. You can also put down here Exodus 21, 1 and following. In other words, verse 17 and 18, he wants to be a servant forever in that household. He said, don't release me. I'll work with you, work for you, be one of your servants forever. Now, you know what that tells me? There must have been something going on real good in that household for somebody to want to do that. They said, you know, man, you're so good to me. I don't want to be freed from this debt. I like it like it is. I get a paycheck, I get food, you're good to me, you treat me like family. There's a lot of that went on in the Old and New Testament with servants and masters and so forth. There's a lot of teaching there, I think, to bring up. But my mind was triggered, talking about don't send them out empty or people that are poor. The Lord has blessed me. I know that He's blessed many of you, but I'm going to tell you something. There was a time when I was in preaching school, and we went to Turkey, and I called my wife and kids one time during that 11, 12-day trip, and I didn't realize it because I got confused. Some things were messed up, and I got a bill when I got home. It was like say $140. Let me tell you something. Back then, $140 may have been $20,000, because, I mean, we were broke. And there was a brother in Christ who said, don't worry about it, because I owed him the money. I'd used his phone on the trip. He said, don't worry about it. It's forgiven. Don't worry. It's just my blessing. I haven't forgotten that. And so you think about that kind of attitude. What a blessing that was to me in that moment. And that's what he's saying here. You want to take care of people properly? Don't forget where you came from. Never forget where you came from. That's why oftentimes in a business, if you're not careful, the first generation builds it, the second generation enjoys it, and the third generation ruins it. Why? Because they're all spoiled rotten by that time. They have trust money and everything else. You got to be careful with these things. Yes, ma'am. Yes. No. Yeah, that's it. That's a great point. Amen. That's a great point. Look at, again, verse 19 and 20. He's dealing with the first belongs to God again. He says again over and over, thou shalt sanctify, you shall sanctify unto the Lord these firstlings. Where? Verse 20, in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. Verse 21, can't be any blemishes. Don't give him the leftovers. Then you get into chapter 16. Before I get into chapter 16, I've written beside verse 21 of chapter 15, Malachi chapter 1, verse 3:8, and Malachi 3. What does he say in Malachi? You're giving me what you wouldn't even give the governor. He wouldn't even accept this trash you're giving him. If you gave these old lame cows to him, you think you're going to give it to God? No, that's not going to work. And so then I wrote down here, what about our time, our dress, our worship? Many principles. Okay, chapter 16, let me just lay it out. Chapter 16, you need to write this down. Verses 1 through 8 is the feast of Passover or / unleavened bread. They're not the same, but they're connected. That's addressed in verses 1 through 8. Then you have the feast of the feast of weeks in verses 9 through 12, which is also called the feast of first fruits or the feast of harvest, or what do we call it in the New Testament? Pentecost. So verses 1 through 8, Passover / unleavened bread. That's because I write my notes like that. Verses 9 through 12 is the feast of weeks, which is the same as the feast of first fruits, harvest, or Pentecost. Then in verses 13 through 17, you have the Feast of Tabernacles, which is also called the Feast of Booths. Okay, now I can tell you, we're not going to get through all these, but I laid that out so that we can get into it maybe next week. But let me just say this, as you study these Old Testament situations, think about the typology. As an example, chapter 16, verse 1, the Passover, where would you go back and study about that being started? Exodus 12. Exodus 12, they had the Passover lamb. They were to remember that they had departed out of Egypt, that God delivered them from bondage. God delivered them from Egypt. No wonder then, in 2 Corinthians 5:7, Jesus is called what? Our Passover. He's referring back to him being the Passover lamb, not literally, but it would represented Christ. They had to shed the blood of the lamb, put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, Exodus 12, as they escaped from Egypt, which represented sin. So in the New Testament, we've escaped from Egypt, representing sin. We're members of the church. And of course, he's our Passover, 2 Corinthians 5:7. So much typology as we study these feasts. These are the three major feasts where all the males had to go 3 times a year, but there were other feast festivals and holy days. You can get into the days, dedication, Purim, study Esther. There's all these different ones. In fact, I wrote a lot of them down here. There's the Sabbath day. Then there's the Day of Atonement. That's a big one, right? Leviticus 16. There's the Feast of Purim, the new moon, sabbatical year, which we just studied about, the release every 7 years. Jubilee, that's every 50 years. Go read Leviticus 25. The Feast of Dedication, there's the Feast of Trumpets, and so forth and so on. But in this chapter, he's reminding them of these 3 major feasts. Now, let me just say this. Bring us back to what Deuteronomy is about. What are they about to do in the next few weeks? Enter the land of Canaan. So Moses is going to die. The book of Deuteronomy, again, only spans about 60, 70 days, 30 days of which are mourning for the death of Moses, because he can't go into the land because of sin. And that other 30 days there, he's given these different sermons and speeches. What is Deuteronomy about? It's about the speeches and sermons of Moses to the generation that are still alive after all the others had died in the wilderness wandering, and he's reminding them of these various laws, many of which are more detailed in Numbers, in Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus. Okay, keep that in mind. We'll maybe hit a little bit more on chapter 16 and get into chapter 17. Well, the end of 16 is dealing with Judges, and that kind of carries us through 17 and so forth. All right, thank you.